Let's talk about all the books that I read in the last year, how I rate them, a brief summary of what each book is about, and if I'd recommend them to you guys. I'm gonna take my glasses off because I don't want the light to glare in the glasses the whole time. So a couple years ago, I actually got into reading. Pre-college Marina despised reading, could not pick up a book to save her life. But I now love books. I have a Kindle, I've read paperback books. I just love reading, especially in the last year. In the last year, I've read 15 books total. I do also use the Goodreads app. If you do want to follow me and see all the books that I've read, I'll leave the link to my profile in the description. I love Goodreads so much. This is not sponsored, but I love Goodreads because you can see what other people are reading, what people recommend. I also love that it gives you a description of all the books, you can rate them, you can add books to a TBR, you can keep track of what you're currently reading, what you've read, and if you link it to your Kindle account, you can track the live progress of the book you're reading. So without further ado, let's talk about all the books that I have read. I'm gonna go in chronological order. The first book is One Italian Summer by Rebecca Sterle. She also wrote In 5 Years, which is another phenomenal book. I gave this book 5 stars. It was a really quick read and it was a really good read. But essentially, this girl loses her mom and she takes a trip that she was supposed to take with her mom to Italy. I don't want to give too much of the plot away for this book because I feel like you really need to go into this book blind to really get that shock from the plot. But this was overall a really good book. It was not a spicy book, but honestly, I feel like this is a really refreshing read to read in between spicy tropes. The next book is Mr. Wrong Number by Lynn Painter. I also give this book 5 stars. This book is like a silly, goofy, spicy book. This girl's apartment burns down and she moves in with her brother who has a roommate, and it's like an enemies to lovers book. It's really good though. I'm also not going to give too much away of this plot because I think, again, you need a raw reaction with this plot. But let's just say she starts texting someone, doesn't know who this person is who's texting her. We'll leave it there. Really good book though. The next book on my list is Happy Place by Emily Henry. I gave this book 4 stars. I think that this is a really solid book with a really good plot. I just think there are a few places in this book where the flow could have been better, but it wasn't a bad book. It was a really good book. It's essentially a couple who's broken up and they haven't told their friends yet, and they're in the same friend group and their friends are getting married, so they have to go on this little wedding trip with them, and because their friends don't know that they're broken up, they have to share a room together. That's kind of the base of the plot. I think that it's very well written. Again, there's a couple points where I feel like the flow of everything could have been a little bit better, but overall I really enjoyed reading this book. Now we're moving into the book of 2024, Icebreaker by Hannah Grace. I know that this is a very overhyped book. I'm fully aware of that. However, when I'm rating a book, I rate it more on the writing style versus the plot because I think those two go hand in hand. So that's why I rate it on the writing style and not the plot, if that makes sense. Anyways, without further ado, I gave this book 5 stars. This book is extremely spicy. This whole series literally has a disclaimer at the beginning of each book because it is so spicy and so explicit, but I think we all know that by now. Anyways, this book is phenomenal. I love the way that Hannah Grace writes her books. You know exactly what the trope is gonna be, but the way that she gets you there is still very exciting. She doesn't lead you on too much and then dissipate with the trope. She gives a steady build, and that's what I really like about her writing. Essentially, this character, Anastasia, is a figure skater. She attends UC Maple Hills and meets Nate Hawkins, who is a hockey player. It's a little bit of an enemies to lovers trope, but it's really well written. I love that there's a big traumatic plot twist. Anyways, it's a very good book, but also your reader's discretion is advised. The next book is The Bodyguard by Katherine. I gave this book 3 stars. I do still think it's worth reading, and it's a pretty decent book. Just near the end, I think the plot just plummets a little bit. I think that this author maybe got to like the climax of the book a little bit too soon, but I do really like the plot. Essentially, it's this character, her name is Hannah, and she's a bodyguard, and she gets hired to be a bodyguard for a celebrity, his name is Jack, who's dealing with a stalker. I would definitely still recommend this book to someone, but I would also say if you get bored easily of books, just keep that in mind. Now let's talk about Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez. I gave this book 5 stars. I actually forgot that I read this book, which doesn't say anything about how good it was. I just read so many books this year that I forgot. This book is amazing. It's essentially this doctor, her name is Brianna, and she's kind of feeling burnt out at her job, and her brother is sick and needs a kidney donor, and essentially another doctor, his name is Jacob, is kind of like her arch nemesis, a little enemies to lovers trope, and they start exchanging letters at work. And that's all I'm gonna say. You can figure out the rest, but it's a really good book. I think it's really well written. I'd really like to read more Abby Jimenez books because I do remember really liking the way that she wrote this book. Moving back to Hannah Grace, Wildfire. Again, I gave this 5 stars. So essentially this series is a 3-part series. I'll talk about the 3rd book in a little bit. It's kind of like an independent book series. So you can read each book individually. You don't need to go through the whole series in chronological order to follow along. You can kind of pick and choose which books you read, if you just want to read Wildfire, if you just want to read Icebreaker. It's the same characters in each plot, but it's a different pair of characters that are the protagonists in each book. I really like this book, and the reason why I like the way that Hannah Grace writes, each book has a very different storyline. So Icebreakers was very hockey forward. Wildfire is based in a summer camp. So in this book, we're focusing more on Russ and we're focusing on Aurora. It's basically just a book about how Russ and Aurora slowly became friends at a summer camp, and you can just figure it out from there. But I just think this book is very well written. I think this book was really nostalgic for me because I grew up going to summer camp and I really liked this book. It was really good. Okay, now we're gonna talk about The Fake Mate by Lana Ferguson. I gave this book 3 stars. I think that the plot line just wasn't for me. It's kind of, in a way, not super fantasy, but it's like you have to really be open to a slight fantasy trope, which I wasn't really into. There was like some sort of canine thing going on, but there was alphas, betas, whatever. That part I had a hard time following along with, but it was kind of giving just coworkers to lovers trope, basically. So if you can follow along with the fantasy part of the plot, I think it's a great book. I just didn't finish it, to be completely honest, because of that. Now we're gonna talk about my other favorite series, the Twisted series. Starting with Twisted Love by Huang, 5 stars, no questions asked. I love how this series develops. This is very similar to Hannah Grace's series, where you can read each book independently or you can read them all in order. The protagonist of this book is Alex and Ava. It's kind of giving rich CEO next door, but they're in college. The plot is so creative, even though you know how the trope is gonna go and who's gonna do what with whom, and that is why I love this series so much. I hope that this series becomes like a movie or a TV show. It is so dramatic and so freaking good. There's sabotage, there's kidnapping. It is a good book. Please read this series. Now we're gonna take a quick break from that series and go back to another Emily Henry book, Funny Story. I gave this book 5 stars. This book is very predictable, but I still really like it. So essentially this girl, her name is Daphne, she has a fiance, his name is Peter. Peter gets with his childhood best friend. Obviously Daphne leaves him and moves in with Peter's fiance's ex-boyfriend, who she cheated on him with, her fiance. So now it's these 2 people who are heartbroken over the same 2 people, and it's just a story about them. I also like this book because there's subplots and everything like that, so even though you're focusing on a main plot, there's other things that happen. I think that it's really good for books to have subplots going on when it's a really predictable trope, because then it still makes things interesting. Okay, now we're back to the Twisted series. Twisted Games. I gave this book 5 stars. Beautiful book. Again, it's the same characters in each book, but it's different protagonists from those characters. So in this book, we are focusing on Bridget, who is a royal of a very small country in Europe, and her bodyguard, Rice, R-H-Y-S. I always read it as Rice. And so it's basically Bodyguard to Lover, but it's really good. And again, I love this series because it is a very simple plot line, but the things that happen in this book are so unique. There's potential for her to become the queen. There's laws that she's concerned about. It's very good. I do want to mention the Twisted series. The books are long, but I've gotten through the ones that I've read pretty quickly, so they're easy reads, but they're longer. Okay, now we're back to Hannah Grace. The most recent book that I have read was Daydream. As we all probably guessed, 5 stars. This book is starring Henry and a new friend that he made, Hal. And basically, Henry is struggling a little bit in his academics. He's also on the hockey team. Hal agrees to help him. She's kind of like a little bookworm. She's writing a book. They become friends. It's kind of friends to lovers. But the way that this book is written... Oh, I'm getting a phone call. One moment. Hello? It was a spam call. Anyways, the book is written in such a realistic way. It's not like they're friends for 2 seconds and then they just hook up, or they're friends like the whole book and then they finally hook up at the end. It's done in a very realistic way where like you can feel the sexual tension while you're reading it, and it kind of grows a little bit. They get super close and they're now besties, but they're physically close with each other, but they think it's like in a friend way, even though all their friends are like, it's not. And then they both love each other, but they don't know how to deal with that. I just think it's a very realistic plot of how friends to lovers would be in the real world. And I think that that is what made this book really good. I just realized that I forgot one book. I haven't read it in the last year, but I read it close enough to the timeline where I wanted to include it, because I've been talking a lot about love tropes and I want to talk about a thriller because it was really good. And I'm not a scary book kind of person. Hidden Pictures by Jason Rekulak. This book is essentially a girl who goes to be a live-in nanny for a little boy. They live in a very nice little neighborhood. She's living in the guest house, or like a shed that was converted into a guest house. Just weird things start happening with their little boy. The girl notices and she's trying to get to the bottom of it. Now, I'm gonna say the first 4 to 5 chapters make it seem like it's gonna be really scary. I promise you, once you get past those chapters, it's more thriller than horror. You just have to get past those chapters. It also includes pictures. I'm not gonna give away what the pictures are, but they add to the story. It's just a really good book. Anyways, those are all of the books that I read most recently in the last year. Again, if you would like to follow me on Goodreads, I'll have it linked down below. I always update my Goodreads with the current books I'm reading. If you're wondering what book I'm currently reading, I'm reading book 3 of the Twisted series. And if you guys have any books that I did not talk about that you would recommend to me, comment them down below so I can add them to my TBR. But with that said, I will see you guys soon in another video. Bye!